Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open the candlelit windows of 18th century France and tiptoeing into the bedrooms, or lack thereof, of some of the most exhausted, over-caffeinated, and fascinating minds in Western philosophy. You're not stepping into castles or palaces, though some of these thinkers certainly wish they had them. No, tonight you're curling up next to Voltaire's ink-stained desk, Rousseau's damp forest patch, or Diderot's disheveled chamber where socks and manuscripts share floor space. Imagine, outside your window, a horse-drawn carriage rattles across cobblestones. The air smells faintly of paraffin and pastry, and the only background noise is the steady scrape of quill against parchment. The beds are short, the cravats are tight, and you're about to discover just how unrestful life was for people whose entire job was to think themselves to sleep. Spoiler: they didn't sleep much. You probably won't survive this night of philosophical slumber parties without yawning halfway to your dreams. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You creak open the door to a Parisian apartment sometime around 1750. The air is stale with candle smoke and the sour trace of wine that's been left out since last night's argument about metaphysics. A chamber pot sits by the bed, discreetly covered but not exactly scent-proof. The sheets are rumpled. The mattress, if you can call it that, is a straw-stuffed sack. The man who lives here is asleep, but not for long. Welcome to the world of Enlightenment thinkers, where sleep is a nuisance to be minimized, something you negotiate with between bursts of philosophical fervor. By candlelight, these men, and occasionally women, worked, wrote, quarreled, and sometimes collapsed into sleep that was never quite deep enough. You watch one of them, perhaps Montesquieu, peel off his wig and stretch with an audible sigh. Sleep didn't arrive easily, not with corsets and laced collars involved. And forget your memory foam mattress, his bed is narrow, wooden, and so creaky it sounds like a moral dilemma every time he shifts. Back then, most people followed segmented sleep. You know, 2 separate periods of rest, interrupted by a couple of hours of wakefulness in the middle of the night. It wasn't insomnia, it was tradition. People would rise after a few hours, maybe write, pray, or even visit neighbors. Yes, at 2 a.m. That middle stretch was called the watch. For philosophers, this was golden time. Quiet. No one asking questions. Just them and their thoughts, and possibly their gout. You shuffle to the hearth where a single candle flickers. This was the only source of light for most Enlightenment scholars at night. Candles were pricey, and some were taxed, so writing at night was a luxury. Still, many burned through their allowance, literally. You wouldn't believe how many great works of Enlightenment thought were composed in rooms full of smoke, half-shadows, and groggy regrets. Some of them, like Condorcet, got around this with oil lamps, more efficient, longer-lasting, and definitely sootier. The downside? Fire hazard. Many scholars' sleep was cut short by fear of accidentally burning down their rented flats while chasing a footnote. You pause near a shelf stuffed with books bound in leather and dust. You notice a small pile of sleep aids, valerian root, maybe a little opium if you're lucky. Nothing knocks out a racing mind like a mild narcotic. But not everyone indulged. Some, like Helvetius, preferred to exhaust themselves with endless walking before bed, pacing the creaky floorboards until the neighbors banged on the ceiling in protest. You sit on the edge of a chair with stuffing escaping from the seams. The room is quiet now. No snoring. Most philosophers, oddly enough, wrote about sleep more than they actually surrendered to it. There's a curious tension in their habits. They respected the restorative power of sleep, sure, but they also treated it like a lazy vice, something best minimized unless you were being poetic about dreams. Historians still argue whether the philosopher's erratic sleep was purely circumstantial, thanks to bad beds, noise, poor nutrition, or whether they truly believed rest was for the weak. Either way, the result was the same. You had a generation of minds half running on caffeine and conviction. Oh, and about that caffeine. By the 18th century, coffee had taken Paris by storm. It wasn't just a morning ritual. Philosophers like Voltaire drank up to 50 cups a day. Yes, 50. You can't smell it now, but this entire room once reeked of roasted beans, ink, and desperation. It's no wonder they had trouble sleeping. As you lean back into the shadows, you hear a muffled sound, a chambermaid walking past, perhaps, or a neighbor dropping a chamber pot lid. Life was communal back then. Thin walls. Shared stairwells. No blackout curtains or white noise machines. You learned to sleep in bursts, whenever and however you could. And you learned to write through the fatigue, or talk through it, or argue at salons until you literally dropped mid-discourse. And let's not forget the fashion. Even bedtime wasn't safe. Those frilly sleeping caps? Necessary for warmth. The nightshirts? Sometimes silk, if you were rich, more often wool and itchy. And shoes. Some people actually slept with their shoes near or on, in case of fires, rats, or surprise arrests. Paris, after all, was not always friendly to contrarian thinkers. You glance at a window and see moonlight spilling over the rooftops. The city isn't asleep. It never really was. Somewhere, someone is still debating whether God exists or whether human nature is good or evil. And in this moment you realize that for these philosophers, sleep was less about recharging and more about retreating, a temporary surrender from the endless war inside their heads. Their dreams? We'll get to those. But first, pull that wool blanket a little tighter. Blow out the candle, but watch your sleeve. And prepare for a long night in the company of men who believed sleep was negotiable, but ideas were eternal. You shift slightly, the wooden floor creaking beneath your weight, as you enter a narrow room cluttered with papers and the sharp aroma of ink and bitter coffee. There, in a high-backed chair with a cushion far too thin for comfort, sits Voltaire, his eyes heavy, yet restless, scanning over another draft of biting commentary aimed at, well, nearly everyone. Voltaire is no stranger to sleep deprivation. In fact, if there were awards for stubbornly outwitting bedtime, he'd have several, engraved, no doubt, with witty insults about the French monarchy. You watch him scribble another sentence in his tight, elegant hand, and you can almost hear his brain humming faster than his heart. Voltaire's real name is François-Marie Arouet, but let's be honest, Voltaire just sounds more like someone who rarely sleeps. He's in his 50s now, full of vigor, biting sarcasm, and a caffeine addiction that would make a barista weep. He claims to sleep about 4 hours a night, but even that seems generous. His servants say he naps here and there, often with his head on the desk, his wig slightly askew, and a quill mark smudged on his cheek. You don't interrupt him. He's mid-rant, possibly about the church, the government, or the tragedy of lukewarm coffee. You notice something odd. There's a lavish bed in the corner, curtained, plump, practically begging to be slept in. But it's clear he rarely uses it. Some nights he sleeps in his armchair. Other times a sofa. He's one of the few who could afford comfort but preferred restlessness. Historians still argue whether this was an aesthetic choice, a political statement, or just chronic back pain. And the coffee, dear heavens, the coffee. Voltaire didn't just drink it. He consumed it like a philosophy in liquid form. He was known to mix chocolate into his brew, because who needs moderation? And reportedly drank dozens of cups daily. His doctor warned him it would kill him. Voltaire responded by living into his 80s. You stifle a yawn just watching him. He's currently penning a letter, perhaps to Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great, or some other influential pen pal. Voltaire's nights were a blur of correspondence, satire, and the occasional moment of theatrical despair. He adored being both admired and banned, preferably at the same time. At this hour, his thoughts seem sharper than ever. He jots down a zinger about superstition, muttering under his breath. There's a strange rhythm to his insomnia, something both manic and meditative. He works until the candle gutters low, then rises and lights another. Sleep doesn't tempt him as much as the next punchline. Occasionally he dozes off mid-thought, quill in hand, only to jolt awake and continue. These micro-naps are all he allows himself. His valet, probably watching from the next room, is ready to remove the ink pot before it spills across yet another priceless manuscript. And yet you can't help but notice, his eyes are tired. Behind the bravado, there's fatigue, bones that ache, joints that protest. But he powers through it, writing, rewriting, and sometimes laughing aloud at his own lines. It's as if the laughter keeps him going. The bed? Still untouched. The only thing on it is a discarded waistcoat and a half-read book about Newton. Voltaire revered science. He once said Newton gave us the key to the universe. But he himself couldn't crack the code to a good night's sleep. You step closer and pick up a page from the floor, another sarcastic jab, maybe destined for Candide, that cheerful little satire about how terrible everything is. There's no doubt Voltaire's sleeplessness fed his brilliance. But it also wore on him. You can feel it in the heaviness of the room, the jitter in his fingers, the candle stubs worn down like nerves. One quirky thing you notice, Voltaire often wore a nightcap not just for warmth but as a prop, a symbol of his own performative intellect. He wanted to look the part of the overworked genius, even when nobody was watching. He was always aware of his legend, even in private. There's a fringe theory, whispered among some scholars, that Voltaire's insomnia wasn't just physical, it was existential. He feared sleep because he feared silence, death, the unknown. He once said, "I have chosen to be happy because it is good for my health," which sounds suspiciously like a man bargaining with the night. Outside, the city murmurs. Horses clop. A street vendor sings a lullaby that's more sales pitch than serenade. Inside, Voltaire is still writing, muttering about hypocrisy and reason. You imagine he'll fall asleep eventually, perhaps mid-word, leaning sideways in that uncomfortable chair. The ink will dry. The candle will burn low. His dreams, if he has any, will probably be in Latin. And even if you could ask him about it, he'd wave away your concern. Sleep, he might say, is a distraction from progress. And then he'd wink, because yes, he was annoying like that. You back out slowly, the door creaking slightly. Voltaire doesn't notice. He's too busy rewriting the French language, one sleepless hour at a time. You step softly now, leaving behind the clamor of Voltaire's caffeine-stained universe and moving into something quieter, greener, and more unsettling in its serenity. You're not in a city anymore. You're in the woods. Damp leaves crinkle under your feet, and somewhere nearby, a stream murmurs over mossy stones. There's a figure lying beneath a tree, wrapped in a thin cloak, snoring faintly. Yes, that's Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the man who thought civilization was the worst idea since sliced bread, except sliced bread hadn't been invented yet, preferred to sleep as nature intended. Sometimes that meant under the stars, on the forest floor, surrounded by the gentle sounds of nocturnal creatures and the not-so-gentle threat of damp socks and bug bites. This wasn't some random stunt. Rousseau genuinely believed sleep, like everything else, should be natural. Beds? Unnecessary. Cities? Corrupting. Pants? Optional, if we're being honest. He was a man of convictions and cold toes. You crouch beside him and watch his chest rise and fall slowly. His cloak smells like leaves and a bit of sheep wool. Fashion was not a priority. A book lies next to him, probably Confessions, his brutally honest autobiography where he describes everything from his bedwetting as a child to his complex feelings about women, dinner parties, and decorative wigs. Back in Paris, people whispered about his habits. Not just the outdoor sleeping thing, but the way he'd vanish for days, hiking into the countryside just to think. He wrote about it with such romanticism that others tried to imitate him, briefly, until the first thunderstorm hit, and they scurried back to their salon chairs and silk robes. Historians still argue whether Rousseau's forest sleep was an act of rebellion, a coping mechanism, or simply eccentricity turned lifestyle. Some say he had a trauma-linked sensitivity to city noise and lights. Others say he used nature as a prop, part of his larger narrative that humanity was better off before enlightenment, agriculture, or polite dinner conversation. You gently brush a leaf off his shoulder and notice his breathing hitch. He's dreaming. Probably about freedom, or betrayal, or goats. Dreams were important to Rousseau. He considered them windows to truth. In his writings, dreams often revealed deeper moral insight, or at least the need for a long walk and a piece of bread. You can almost feel the philosophical weight he carried. His theories about the noble savage and the corrupting influence of society would ripple through revolutions and counter-revolutions alike. But right now, he's just a tired man curled up under a tree, with muddy boots and a tendency to sleep diagonally. Quirky fact: Rousseau also believed music shaped the soul and often sang to himself before bed. Not opera, simple tunes, sometimes invented, sometimes hummed while he fiddled with blades of grass. It was his way of calming down before sleep, a sort of rustic lullaby with no lyrics except maybe, "Leave me alone." You shift, trying to find a dry patch to sit on, and wonder how he didn't catch pneumonia. He did get sick often, bronchitis, fevers, mysterious aches, but he chalked it up to society's poison, not, say, sleeping in a swamp. Medical science wasn't exactly invited to his personal party. Sometimes he stayed in a cottage, preferably one without servants, walls that were too thick, or anything too luxurious. One of his favorite pastimes was rearranging modest furniture so it looked less bourgeois. A mattress? Maybe. But a thin one. Hard beds were virtuous. Pillows were suspect. When he wasn't in the woods or on the road, Rousseau's sleep schedule was irregular. He had long stretches of insomnia, often tied to anxiety. He worried about reputation, betrayal, whether he'd locked horns with the wrong nobleman again. You'd think sleeping in nature would soothe that. It didn't. Not always. Still, you have to admire his stubbornness. He didn't just preach natural living, he lived it, slept it, sniffled through it. He rejected salons, not just socially but physically. He thought being awake at night, alone with the wind and stars, was healthier than listening to people debate over cheese and Voltaire's latest insult. Sometimes, though, he did miss human company. You can read it between the lines in his letters. He had complicated friendships, especially with women, and many of them fretted over his habits. A few even tried to get him to sleep indoors more often. He refused, then wrote essays about the tyranny of good intentions. The forest around him rustles. Maybe a fox. Maybe a metaphor. Either way, Rousseau doesn't stir. His hair is a mess. His boots are damp. But there's peace on his face, a kind of stubborn peace that only someone absolutely sure of their worldview could manage. And despite everything, the questionable hygiene, the allergy risk, the sheer impracticality, his sleep out here seems more genuine than anything you saw in Voltaire's city flat. It's raw, unpolished. It belongs to him. You lie back on the cold earth, trying to imagine what he sees in his dreams. Maybe he's back in Geneva, arguing with priests. Maybe he's inventing a new social contract. Maybe he's just trying to find a dry place to pee without stepping in cow dung. The possibilities are endless. Eventually, the stars slide behind clouds, and a drizzle begins. You look at Rousseau. He's still asleep. Of course he is. You, however, begin to reconsider everything. You dry yourself off with a handkerchief. Well, you try. As you step away from Rousseau's soggy forest bed and into a gloomier, more claustrophobic corner of Enlightenment France. The city has returned. The walls close in. The smell of wet wool and scorched parchment welcomes you like a musty hug. You're in Diderot's world now, though calling it restful would be a wild exaggeration. Denis Diderot, best known as the architect of the Encyclopédie, had a relationship with sleep that can only be described as reluctant. If Voltaire ran on coffee and sass, and Rousseau on moss and resentment, Diderot ran on pure, unfiltered anxiety. You can tell just by looking at him, bags under his eyes deep enough to store unsold copies of Volume 3. He's not asleep when you arrive, of course. It's 3:12 a.m., and he's pacing in a loose-fitting robe that may once have been blue but now resembles something between soot and surrender. His hair is disheveled. He mutters to himself as he passes stacks of books and notes, most of which he insists are not messy, just temporarily unstructured. Diderot was a master of distraction. He'd sit down to write about mineralogy, and somehow end up questioning free will. He wasn't just creating an encyclopedia. He was building an argument, one volume at a time, against ignorance itself. Sleep? That was something peasants did when the sun set. Diderot had ideas, and they never waited until morning. There's something charming about his disarray, though. He's scribbling on loose paper now, shaking his head, then crossing things out so hard the table wobbles. He once said, "When I write, I sleep poorly. When I don't write, I sleep worse." You can't tell if that's ironic or deeply tragic, but either way, it's on brand. You find a chair. It creaks. Everything in here creaks. And you glance around at his belongings. A tiny tin of dried lavender, meant to help with sleep, lies unopened on a cluttered shelf. Beside it, a broken candle snuffer, and under that, an old volume of Lucretius that he probably tried to read in Latin as a lullaby. The walls are thin, so thin, you can hear a neighbor coughing 2 floors up. Diderot doesn't notice. He's writing a paragraph about human suffering and simultaneously munching on stale bread. This is peak multitasking. It's also 18th century French insomnia in a nutshell. Unlike Rousseau, who romanticized dreams and nature, Diderot often viewed the night as a necessary evil. If sleep had a purpose, it was to reset the mind for more analysis. He respected the body, yes, but he treated it like a tool, not something to pamper. A tool that frequently broke down from overuse. You might think a man assembling one of the greatest reference works in human history would have assistants, researchers, a support group of sorts. Nope. Most nights, it was just him, a feather pen, and the occasional hallucination brought on by stress and stale cheese. You wouldn't be surprised if he started arguing with his own shadow. Historians still argue whether Diderot's insomnia was self-imposed, part of the writer's curse, or the result of financial stress, social pressure, and the looming threat of censorship. He was arrested more than once for his work. You don't sleep deeply when you're worried the king might knock on your door with a warrant. What's quirky about Diderot, though, is that he sometimes pretended to sleep just to avoid certain guests. He'd instruct his servant to tell people he was napping, when in fact he was furiously editing an entry on botany. That's right, Diderot weaponized fake sleep. Petty? Absolutely. Effective? Also yes. Tonight, however, there's no pretending. He looks genuinely exhausted. He rubs his temples, mutters something about the tyranny of facts, and finally slumps into a corner armchair, not even bothering to clear the books from it. He dozes off sitting upright, one leg still twitching as if trying to outrun his own footnotes. You'd think that with all the intellectual energy, he'd dream in math equations or Enlightenment ideals. But Diderot once confessed that he dreamed mostly about food and losing his shoes. This, somehow, feels deeply relatable. He snores once, sharp, startled, and wakes himself. You pretend not to notice. He looks around, confused, then smiles faintly. Maybe he dreamed of being on time for once. He rarely was. Deadlines for the encyclopedia were missed often, mostly because Diderot would rewrite entire sections out of spite or inspiration. The candle beside him gutters low. He doesn't notice. He's staring at the ceiling now, whispering something about Voltaire. Probably another imaginary debate. They wrote each other letters so cutting they could double as kitchen knives, yet shared a grudging respect. And the room grows colder. Diderot pulls the robe tighter, frowns at a loose window latch, then finally stands to tuck himself into a makeshift bed, a pile of blankets on a lumpy mattress that looks like it lost an argument with time. You don't see a pillow. Just a rolled-up jacket. Sleep isn't a luxury here, it's a surrender. He mutters one last thought. It's all absurd anyway. And closes his eyes. You wait. Silence. A page flutters from the desk and lands near your foot. It's half a definition of sleep, from the unfinished zoology section. The last line simply reads, "A state we enter reluctantly, but one we rarely escape willingly." You lean back and smile. For a man so skeptical of miracles, Diderot made sleep look like the strangest of them all. You step over the fallen page from Diderot's desk, careful not to disturb it, as if doing so might accidentally summon another definition of fatigue, and slip back into the flickering streets of Paris, where salons still hum like overworked mines at midnight. You think maybe, just maybe, someone out there is asleep. But then you hear laughter. Tinkling, wine-slick laughter. It's a salon night. You're not late. You're just deeply unwanted by this hour, but you enter anyway. The ceiling is high, the curtains are velvet, and the air smells of perfume, powdered wigs, and intellectual exhaustion. Welcome to the social arena where Enlightenment thinkers stayed up way too late arguing about everything from virtue to volume taxes. You look around. Philosophers, poets, scientists, all crammed into a room lit entirely by candlelight and social anxiety. The chairs are embroidered. The wine is flowing. The opinions are louder than the harpsichord. And the time? Roughly 11:47 p.m. You sit near a cluster of thinkers mid-debate. One woman in a gown the size of a small boat leans in and says, "Rousseau has it wrong. Man is not born free. He is born with gout and bad posture." Everyone chuckles. Except for the guy actually suffering from gout. He groans softly in the corner. Salons, for all their elegance, were brutal to sleep schedules. They usually didn't even start until after dinner, around 9 or 10 p.m., and could roll on until the early hours of morning. And these weren't passive gatherings. Oh no. Everyone had to be sharp, charming, witty, just controversial enough to be fascinating but not enough to get exiled. It was a verbal ballet, on stilts, while sleep waited politely at the door, forever uninvited. You spot someone nodding off in the corner, possibly Buffon. He's been talking about geology for 3 hours and now seems to be dreaming about sediment. A nearby servant gently nudges him awake with a tray of madeleines. Historians still argue whether the salon's nocturnal rhythm was about convenience or performance. Some suggest it was simple. Paris was hot, crowded, and chaotic during the day, so the elite turned night into their playground. Others say it was social theater. Stay late enough, drink enough, and maybe someone will remember your pun about Descartes for the next 300 years. You yawn. So does the person next to you. She stifles it behind an embroidered fan, like it's a scandal. Sleepiness at a salon was seen as weak, a sign of intellectual disengagement or worse, boredom. People practiced the art of looking alert, while spiritually asleep. It's like modern Zoom meetings, only with more lace. You try to count how many candles are burning. Maybe 40? 50? Each one dripping wax into expensive holders. Candlelight didn't just light the room, it dictated behavior. You had to stay near it, face it, speak in its glow. The farther you sat from the light, the more invisible you became. A philosophical metaphor? Probably. This was France, after all. And the topics? Everything from whether religion was a useful fiction to how much asparagus was too much. Some debates were deadly serious. Others, deliciously ridiculous. You catch one man passionately arguing that sleep is merely an illusion created by an idle mind. His friend counters with, "Tell that to my feet after standing all day." It's oddly convincing. Some salons had back rooms, plush, slightly darker spaces where people could nap discreetly or recover from wine-induced epiphanies. You peek inside one now and see a philosopher snoring gently beside a bust of Cicero. It's oddly peaceful, like a university nap with better furniture. Others weren't so lucky. You hear tales of attendees collapsing mid-conversation and being carried out discreetly, like fallen intellectual soldiers. Their reputations often recovered faster than their dignity. Quirky side note: some hosts actually timed the debates. Madame Geoffrin, a famed salonier, reportedly had a subtle bell she'd ring when a conversation ran too long. Think of it as 18th century topic moderation. And if you fell asleep during one of her evenings? You'd likely be banished to the quiet room, with the philosophers' coats, and an elderly spaniel named Brutus. Of course, not all salons were about ideas. Some were about flirtation, alliances, and the delicate art of being seen without being judged. That kind of social performance didn't exactly invite restfulness. People left wired, gossip out, and internally replaying every pun they made. Sleep came slowly, if at all. By now, the room is thinning. A few guests linger. Someone recites Voltaire from memory. Someone else accidentally knocks over a candlestick, and is promptly offered more wine to drown the embarrassment. You slip out quietly and step into the street, where the air feels cooler, the city quieter, but not asleep. In the distance, another salon glows like a lighthouse for the overly articulate. Maybe Diderot is there now, half asleep in a corner, whispering something bitter about enlightenment fatigue. And you realize, these salons weren't just social. They engineered sleep deprivation. The expectation of participation, the late-night caffeine, the theatrical intellect, it all conspired to keep the mind buzzing long after the doors closed. You reach the edge of the square and glance back. The laughter has dimmed, but the candlelight still dances in the upper windows. You wonder how many of those philosophers will find sleep tonight. Maybe a few. More likely, they'll lie in bed thinking about what they should have said when the topic turned to Spinoza. As for you, your feet ache, your mind buzzes, and you start to understand why so many of these thinkers were just a little unhinged. Sleep, like truth, was always just out of reach. You pull your coat tighter as the night lingers and the street grows colder. The last salon door clicks shut behind you. Paris, muffled under its own fog, finally starts to settle. But you're heading somewhere else. A philosopher's bedroom, this time. A quiet one. Or so you think. You enter a modest room, bare wood floors, one high-backed chair, and a bed that looks more ceremonial than comfortable. There's a folded blanket at the foot, stiff with age. And on the nightstand, a small porcelain cup with something dark and still steaming. Hot chocolate. Yes, hot chocolate. This is what passes for sleep prep in 18th century France. Forget melatonin or sleep podcasts. You've got candles, caffeine, and chronic cold feet. You sit on the edge of the bed. It creaks like a guilty conscience. The sheets are stiff, the mattress lumpy, and it's clear nobody here is falling asleep without a minor battle. That hot chocolate? Delicious, yes, but also counterproductive. It's laced with sugar, sometimes spiced with chili or cinnamon, and most certainly a poor prelude to rest. But it was fashionable, and that's what mattered. You glanced at the candlestick. Wax trails like tears down its side. Candles weren't just light, they were the clock. No one had reliable watches. You measured bedtime by flame length. When the last stub guttered out, that was it. Lights off. Whether you were ready or not. Candlelight was romantic in theory, until you had to read by it. Squinting over treatises by flickering orange glow wasn't exactly conducive to winding down. Eye strain? Constant. Smudged ink? Frequent. And yet they kept at it. No blue light filters, no ambient music. Just the sound of wax crackling and thoughts that wouldn't stop. And let's talk about the temperature. There's no fireplace in this room. Maybe the chimney was blocked. Maybe they ran out of coal. Either way, your toes are turning to marble. Central heating didn't exist, and insulation was theoretical at best. Philosophers often bundled into bed fully clothed, stockings, wool layers, sometimes even their outerwear. Rousseau might have loved nature's chill, but most folks just gritted their teeth and shivered until sleep arrived. Historians still argue whether these chilly environments actually aided sleep, or just trained 18th century thinkers to become philosophical about frostbite. There's evidence that people bundled under multiple quilts, sometimes even shared beds just for warmth, which makes sense in theory, until you're trying to debate metaphysics with someone snoring an inch from your face. You lie down, pulling the rough blanket over your chest. It smells faintly of lavender and something else. Possibly damp pages. Possibly goat. Hard to say. The pillow is thin, the bed frame unforgiving. You try shifting positions. You try not to think about the drafts slipping in through the cracks around the windowpane. The door creaks. A scholar shuffles in, glasses slipping down his nose, hands stained with ink. He frowns at the bed, as if blaming it for his insomnia. He mumbles something about Descartes and sits by the candle, relighting it. You realize you're in the presence of yet another night owl, someone whose idea of a bedtime routine involves outlining an argument about the soul. No chamomile tea. No fluffy socks. Just a dozen open books and cold, stubborn feet. Caffeine enters the picture again. Not just coffee. Not just chocolate. But also tea, which was starting to trend in French intellectual circles thanks to English influence. Philosophers claimed it helped them think more clearly, which is code for stay awake and ruin tomorrow. Even more curious, some thinkers took cold baths before bed, believing it shocked the system into slumber. Others went the opposite direction, bundling under so many layers they could barely move, sweating out their worries like academic dumplings. There was no consensus on how to get to sleep, only a shared understanding that it was difficult. You spot a diary on the desk. The philosopher has scrawled a note. 2:19 a.m., still not asleep. Attempted logic puzzles. Failed. Foot cold. A relatable entry across centuries. Quirky tidbit. Some Enlightenment figures believed dreams could be controlled by sleeping in specific positions. Right side, better for digestion. Left side, divine visions. On your back? Nightmare central. You shift uncomfortably and wonder how many people actually tried this and ended up with divine indigestion instead. The philosopher sighs, finally snuffing the candle again. The room returns to shadows. He shuffles to bed, still in his robe, muttering a final thought that sounds suspiciously like, "What is the point of everything if socks cannot stay dry?" You lie beside him in the dark, metaphorically, you're not that weird, and notice how quiet the room becomes. No car horns. No buzzing lights. Just your own breath and the occasional creak as the bed adjusts its complaints. This is what passed for sleep hygiene in the 1700s. Stay up late, sip chocolate, read metaphysics, wrap yourself in wool, pray you don't freeze, and hope your last thought wasn't about Rousseau. It's no wonder so many philosophers seem perpetually agitated. If your toes were freezing and your mattress was straw, you'd write long essays about the futility of existence too. You close your eyes, not because you're sleepy, but because there's nothing else to do. The fire's gone out. The thoughts are still bouncing around, but your body is giving up. Slowly. Softly. Just before sleep, the philosopher whispers into the dark. Perhaps truth arrives only after the third yawn. You don't answer. But you agree. The room is still, and the fire has long since died out. But your journey isn't done. Not yet. Now you slip, softly, slowly, into the minds of the philosophers themselves, into the strange twilight realm of their dreams. Or perhaps their nightmares. You find yourself not in a real place, but a hazy liminal world of flickering shadows and abstract architecture, a dreamscape cobbled together from ink stains and candle smoke. And just there, across a misty courtyard, Rousseau is dreaming again. He's running, not from anything, not toward anything. Just running. Barefoot, naturally. Leaves brush his ankles as he searches for something he can't name. A truth? A friend? Maybe just the way out of a labyrinth made of his own anxieties. And it makes sense. Rousseau often wrote that dreams carried emotional truths. They weren't random. They were meaningful. If he dreamed of betrayal, it was because he feared it. If he dreamed of walking, endlessly walking, it was because he never felt quite at home in the waking world. Back in the waking world, 18th-century French philosophers were fascinated by sleep's darker side. Not just rest, but what happened in that slippery, irrational place after your eyes closed. Many kept dream journals. Voltaire, for example, once recounted a dream where he was chased by Jesuits down a hallway that morphed into a giant dictionary. Subtle. You turn a corner and suddenly you're in Diderot's dream. Naturally, it's a library, but one where every book argues back. He picks up a volume on astronomy, and it yells at him about botany. A dictionary keeps rearranging its entries. Diderot spins in a slow circle and mutters, of course, as pages fly like bats. It's funny, and yet unsettling. Many Enlightenment thinkers believed dreams were fragments of the soul trying to speak. Others feared them. There was a fine line between revelation and madness. Dreams could be divine whispers, or just indigestion. Historians still argue whether 18th-century dream analysis was proto-psychology or superstition with better vocabulary. You hear whispers. Gentle at first, then louder. You walk through a dream shared by the salons, a group nightmare, if you will. A candlelit room, too bright. Everyone speaking at once, ideas overlapping like dueling violins. One woman tries to debate the nature of justice while her dress catches fire. No one notices. Someone else can't find their manuscript. Someone else is naked and still correcting someone's Latin. These dreams aren't restful. They're hectic, social, brimming with unspoken anxieties. The philosophers' waking lives were cerebral marathons, so of course their sleep was a chaotic after-party. You drift again. This time you're with Ovidius. He's snoring, loudly, but inside his dream he's calmly dissecting a large golden brain on a marble table. As one does. Every time he prods it with a quill, it recites lines from Horace. This dream might actually be relaxing for him. And then, of course, there's the devil. Oh yes. Many 18th-century French thinkers still carried the lingering Catholic fear of nighttime demons. Even the most rational minds sometimes confess to odd nocturnal visions. Shadowy figures, voices in the dark, oppressive pressure on the chest. Nightmares were not just bad dreams, they were sometimes interpreted as spiritual attacks. Voltaire mocked this, then wrote, privately, about a recurring dream where he was judged by a tribunal of headless priests. You feel a chill as you wander into another layer of this world. It's not hellish. Not quite. But it is eerie. Beds float without legs. Candles burn underwater. Time moves backwards. A clock ticks louder and louder until it bursts into flames. And over there? That's a dream version of Rousseau and Voltaire arguing while asleep. One of them is a bird. You don't ask why. Sleep itself was a mystery to these thinkers. Science hadn't quite cracked it yet. So even the most logical minds sometimes tiptoed into magical thinking to explain the images behind their eyelids. Were they memories? Messages? Madness? One curious fringe theory floated among a few eccentric intellectuals, that philosophers had different dreams than ordinary people. Deeper. More symbolic. You can almost hear Voltaire laughing at that idea, possibly from within a dream about a debate where all the judges are parrots. And yet, some dreams did inspire real change. Take Condorcet. He reportedly had a vivid dream about dying alone in prison, which tragically foreshadowed the real thing. He wrote about it ominously. Others dreamt of political uprisings, of letters lost or lovers gone cold. The Enlightenment was obsessed with meaning, and dreams, those wild, unsorted moments of night, offered just enough mystery to obsess over. You drift through the last layer of the dreamscape now. Here, the philosophers' faces blur. They sleep side by side in mismatched beds. One snores, one whispers a quote from Plato. One just smiles. Maybe they're finally at peace. The dream slows. The color fades. You hear the sound of soft wind over pages. You feel warmth from a candle that isn't there. And just as you prepare to wake up, a final voice mutters, "The dream is not the lie. It's the preface." You don't know who said it, but you believe them. You blink slowly as the dreams dissolve, slipping once more into the brittle daylight of 18th-century France, or rather, the mid-afternoon haze where philosophers occasionally did the unthinkable, nap. Yes, nap. Not exactly revolutionary, but in the age of enlightenment, even napping came with caveats. You step into a sun-drenched study, where the curtain is drawn just enough to paint golden slashes across the floor. The room smells faintly of old parchment and something sweeter, perhaps orange water, popular then for freshening up before visitors arrived. There, on a narrow chaise longue, is a man napping in broad daylight. His shoes are still on. Boots, really, because no one casually slipped into something comfortable back then, and one arm dangles dramatically over the side like a swooning aristocrat in a poorly written romance. Midday sleep was a bit of a scandal for Enlightenment philosophers. Publicly, many of them dismissed it as sloth. Privately, well, you see the results. Naps were taken, often disguised as digestive rest or solitary contemplation. Rousseau, despite his love for the natural order, frequently dozed under trees. Voltaire would sneak in 20-minute bursts between writing tirades. And Diderot, when he wasn't pacing like a feral editor, occasionally collapsed on a pile of his own essays. But here's the twist. While napping was physically common, it was socially complex. Long midday rests were often associated with the idle rich or the emotionally delicate. So if you were a philosopher trying to look like a hardened truth seeker, you didn't admit to snoozing with a biscuit halfway to your mouth. You sit beside the chaise longue and peer at the philosopher's desk. It's cluttered, naturally. There's a small vial of smelling salts, just in case his post-nap fog turned into full-on ennui, and a cooling cup of watered-down wine. And near it a letter. Half-finished. Something about whether society can ever truly be virtuous if it rewards luxury naps. The irony is thick. Quirky tidbit. Some Enlightenment figures believed naps should be scheduled for maximum mental output. A few even kept detailed charts. Sleep between 1:15 and 2 o'clock, then write a letter, then read Latin until supper. Of course, these charts rarely survived real life. Conversations ran long. Coffee hit late. Existential crises rarely respected calendars. Historians still argue whether these naps were restorative or simply unavoidable consequences of the philosopher's bizarre lifestyle. After all, if you sleep 4 hours a night, your body's going to cash in somewhere. The afternoon was often the least productive period anyway. Minds dulled. Rooms warmed. Eyelids betrayed their owners. And sometimes naps weren't about sleep at all. In more than one case, the resting philosopher was actually eavesdropping, using a convenient horizontal pose to gather gossip from assistants or observe students without being drawn into debate. Passive research, if you will. But real napping? That took skill. You had to navigate the fine line between refreshing pause and accidental coma. Without clocks, people relied on candle marks, the angle of shadows, or gut instinct. If you woke too late, you missed the salon. Too early, and you were cranky during the next metaphysical dispute. You glance down again. The philosopher on the chaise murmurs softly. Possibly a dream. Possibly a quote. Hard to tell. His nap position isn't exactly graceful. His wig has slid slightly sideways, and his cravat has twisted into something resembling a pretzel. But there's peace here. Rare, elusive peace. In the next room, you hear soft conversation. Not quite gossip, but the sort of observational chatter that swells in educated homes when someone's sleeping and everyone else has too much caffeine. Someone whispers that he always naps after reading Pascal. Someone else says it's probably the wallpaper. You smile. Enlightenment thinkers were terrible at rest, but they were excellent at overthinking it. Even naps were dissected, debated, sometimes even moralized. Was it a sin of indulgence? A clever tactic for genius? Or just an ancient human truth that no philosophy could erase? Rousseau, you recall, once wrote that children should nap freely, whenever tired, as dictated by nature. Adults, he seemed to imply, forgot how to listen to their bodies. So perhaps these secret naps were not failures, but tiny acts of rebellion against the rigidity of Enlightenment reason. You move to the window and open it just a crack. Warm air stirs. Somewhere, bells ring for the hour, but you're not sure which one. The philosopher stirs, opens one eye, and groans quietly. He's awake, but not proud of it. He rubs his face and mutters something about lost time, then reaches for a pen. Of course. Even after a nap, these minds couldn't stop. Rest was not an escape. It was a temporary lull between obsessions. You watch as he begins to scribble, the ink slow to flow, the thoughts even slower. But they come. They always do. Before you leave, you glance back. The chaise longue still bears the impression of his body. The light has shifted. The day is aging. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you admit something to yourself. You could really use a nap. You find yourself inside a quieter chamber now, less cluttered, more symmetrical. The walls are pale, the floor swept clean, and in the center of the room stands a bed so elaborately adorned it seems less like a place to sleep and more like a statement. And it is. You're now in the realm of beds as status symbols, where sleep wasn't just a necessity, but a performance of power, taste, and class. The bed before you is draped in heavy brocade, its posts carved with spirals and leaves, like something that might sprout blossoms overnight if only it weren't so self-important. The mattress, if you peeled back the layers, is stuffed with feathers from various birds, each chosen for softness, or so the story goes. On the bed sits no philosopher. Not yet. But the bed itself already speaks. In the 18th century, particularly among France's elite, the bed had transcended its original function. For the thinkers of the Enlightenment, especially those on the fringe of aristocratic circles, beds weren't just for sleeping. They were social stages. People received visitors in bed, debated policy, ate grapes, had their portraits painted. Some even died in them, dramatically, quoting Cicero or whispering final truths about virtue. You run a finger along the silk coverlet. It's smooth, almost smug. If Voltaire ever stayed here, and he probably did, briefly, he would have scoffed, then made 3 jokes about the hypocrisy of sleeping in luxury while writing tracts on social reform. But he still would have napped on it. You examine the rest of the room. There's a side table with a gold-trimmed hand mirror. A decorative clock, silent now. A candlestick with matching snuffer, this one actually intact. Everything here was meant to show refinement. Even the chamber pot is porcelain, with delicate floral patterns. It's ridiculous. It's perfect. Not every philosopher had this kind of setup. In fact, most didn't. Diderot's mattress was reportedly so sad it would squeak in protest whenever he rolled over. Rousseau often avoided beds altogether, claiming that nature offered better posture. But when they did encounter opulence, when they were guests at a duchess's estate or a patron's summer home, they marveled. Or mocked. Or both. Historians still argue whether these lavish beds corrupted the philosopher's spirit or simply reflected the contradiction of Enlightenment life. Thinkers who preached simplicity often lived complexly. And sleep, being the most vulnerable act, became a surprisingly political space. Take the canopy bed, for example. Those dramatic curtains? Sure, they kept in warmth. But more importantly, they offered privacy, even mystery. Behind those drapes, one might sleep, or read, or plot revolutions. They were shields against both cold air and prying eyes. Voltaire once referred to canopy beds as chambers within chambers, a perfect place to dream and hide. You sit on the edge and it barely dips under your weight. Firm. Regal. Intentionally elevated above the ground. In the 18th century, sleeping on the floor or on a low pallet was associated with poverty or sickness. Beds like this were meant to lift you, literally and figuratively, above the common fray. Some were even designed with steps. Yes, steps. Climbing into bed became an event, a ritual, a declaration. Quirky fact, some philosophers, when forced to sleep in these grand beds, found themselves too nervous to relax. Diderot once joked that he couldn't sleep unless the springs creaked and something bit his ankle. A bed this fancy was suspicious. What if it swallowed him whole? But others? They leaned in. Montesquieu, for instance, was said to write long passages from under his velvet coverlets, using the edge of a breakfast tray as a writing desk. He called it thinking horizontally, a luxury, a privilege, and maybe, occasionally, a brilliant workaround to back pain. You look up and notice a small painting above the bed. A classical scene, Apollo chasing Daphne. Completely unrelated to sleep, but tasteful, symbolic. In these bedrooms, even the artwork had to match the mood. Enlightened, refined, slightly exhausting. There's no denying it, for all the talk of reason and utility, French Enlightenment culture adored appearances. The philosopher's sleep environment often reflected his internal contradictions, comfortable yet anxious, elegant yet restless. Beds were both comfort zones and battlegrounds. Even bedding had meaning. Linen thread count was discussed in polite company. Embroidery signaled class. Nightshirts were judged not only by warmth but stitching. The idea of slipping into bed in silence and forgetting the world was almost radical. These people didn't sleep, they staged sleep. You lie back and let the fabric envelop you. It's too soft. The pillow smells like rosewater. There's a faint crinkling sound under the sheets, possibly starch, possibly pride. You wonder how much real rest anyone got in such a curated environment. And yet, it's quiet here. The drapes shut out the world. The featherbed holds you gently. For the first time tonight you feel drowsy. You let your eyes close and imagine a philosopher slipping into the same bed after a night of drinking, debating, and denying the existence of innate morality. He sighs. His wig is off. His thoughts are still swirling. But even he, especially he, needs this, the comfort, the stillness, the pretense of peace. The bed doesn't judge. It only cradles. And as your breath slows, you realize the truth. Sometimes even the most brilliant minds need a place to collapse. You wake, not in a bed, but seated at a rickety writing desk with an ink-stained quill still in hand. Outside the window, a pale sun rises reluctantly over the Paris skyline, brushing rooftops with weak light. The room is quiet except for the soft rustle of paper, the occasional creak of ancient timber, and the sighs of someone who didn't sleep well, again. Welcome to the morning after, specifically, the kind of morning where philosophers crawl out of bed, or off floors, chaise longues, or other questionable surfaces, and immediately begin writing about how little they slept. You're leafing through letters now, real ones, inked in cramped script, full of complaints, apologies, and philosophical reflections laced with grogginess. This is the world of letters from sleepless Paris, a city where Enlightenment thinkers kept epistolary relationships as passionately as they kept insomnia. If Twitter had existed back then, Voltaire would have been banned. Twice. You pick up one such letter, scrawled by Diderot. The first line reads, "I could not sleep last night, though I tried wine, logic, and the dullest pages of Plato." The man tried to bore himself into unconsciousness. It didn't work. Letters were often written in the early morning hours, when the world was quiet and the philosopher was too tired to self-edit. This is where you find the good stuff. The vulnerable lines. The cranky musings. The wildly off-topic tangents about bedbugs, candle smoke, and philosophical dread. One scholar writes, "The ceiling creaked as if Descartes himself were pacing above me. I hope it was just the mice." Another, slightly bitter from love lost, pens, "Your absence robbed me of sleep." Or maybe it was the cheese. Historians still argue whether these sleep-starved letters reflect genuine suffering or theatrical self-expression. The line between honesty and literary flair was as thin as the paper they wrote on. But one thing's clear, poor sleep was a badge of both complaint and honor. You glance through a letter from Voltaire to one of his many correspondents, possibly Frederick the Great. He's mid-rant about Jesuits, then suddenly digresses into a paragraph about being woken by a thunderstorm and accidentally setting his nightcap on fire. He ends the letter by suggesting sleep is a monarchist conspiracy. These letters weren't always about ideas. Often, they were about bodies. Aching ones, Tired ones? Minds that wouldn't quiet down. Voltaire called it his racing lantern, his brain running circles in the dark, full of light but unable to turn off. You've had that feeling too. We all have. And there's a funny pattern. Many of these thinkers believed their insomnia was productive. If they couldn't sleep, they might as well write. Might as well churn out another page, another argument, another letter to some unsuspecting duke or duchess. This wasn't laziness, it was literary overflow. You find a note from a young thinker to his mentor. I tried to sleep last night but was plagued by the thought that all my beliefs are merely prejudices dressed up as principles. Also, the cat would not stop yowling. You have to smile. That sentence perfectly captures the Enlightenment, a philosophical crisis, and a cat. Quirky fact: some letter writers claimed they could tell which hour of the night a letter was written just by the tone. Midnight was sharp and ironic. 2 a.m. was poetic. 4 a.m. was where the madness crept in. The handwriting often sloped accordingly. You read a line from a letter that's half poetry, half exhaustion. Sleep dodges me as deftly as truth dodges the mob. Another philosopher confesses. I rose from my bed convinced I had solved the riddle of existence. By breakfast, I had misplaced both the thought and my wig. Not all letters were philosophical masterpieces. Some were just tired ramblings. I slept for 15 minutes. I think it counted. My valet disagrees. But even in these weary lines, you hear the rhythm of minds that couldn't slow down. Sleep didn't fit neatly into the Enlightenment's calendar. It intruded. It delayed projects. It became a theme, accidentally or not, in the literature of the era. Some letters even debated sleep itself. Was it indulgent? Noble? Necessary? One writer declares, "We are closest to death when we sleep, and so I delay it, night after night, by the flicker of a single flame." A beautiful thought, if deeply impractical. You place the letters back in their box. The sun is fully up now, and Paris stirs with footsteps, creaks, and the clink of teacups. The philosophers are rising. Or at least pretending to. Some will nap again in the afternoon. Some will fight their bodies until midnight once more. But in this quiet hour, their voices remain, scrawled in ink, tinged with exhaustion, and oddly comforting. Because if even the greatest minds in history couldn't get a decent night's sleep, maybe you're doing just fine. You're stepping outside again, gently now, into a dim cobblestone alley still slick with dew, the kind that wraps itself around your ankles like a silent fog. The sky is that odd pre-dawn gray, and Paris breathes slowly. The city isn't awake, but it isn't quite asleep either. This liminal hour belongs to the rule-makers and the rule-breakers. And tonight your attention drifts toward a strange tension that curled up beside Enlightenment thinkers as they tried to sleep. The ever-present friction between the philosophes and the church. Because yes, while many French philosophers dreamed about virtue, truth, and very possibly well-roasted fowl, they also dreamed of freedom from the old bedtime rules imposed by clerical power. You wander past a small chapel now. Its bell doesn't ring until morning, but its presence lingers in every shuttered window. Sleep, like so much else in 18th-century France, was entangled with doctrine. Back then, church life heavily influenced bedtime routines. In rural areas, the ringing of evening bells often marked when to extinguish candles, close shutters, and say prayers. City life, less orderly, still bowed to church customs in subtle ways, curfews, lighting laws, public morality codes. And for thinkers who pushed against ecclesiastical authority, this meant sleep itself became political. You walk past a philosopher's home, Voltaire's again, perhaps. Inside, the fire is out, but a candle still burns in a far room. He wasn't a fan of the church dictating anything, least of all when to go to bed. He famously criticized monastic schedules as unnatural, even cruel. The idea of rising at 4 a.m. to chant in Latin? Torture with incense, he once called it. Quirky detail. Some municipalities had candle taxes, literally charging citizens for nighttime illumination. This wasn't just about economy. It was a moral nudge. Don't stay up too late. Don't indulge in nocturnal thought. Go to bed when the city says you should. But philosophers? They often resisted, both in words and behavior. They wrote by illegal candlelight. They walked past curfew. They held salons long after midnight, discussing everything from metaphysics to what if we didn't pay our tithes anymore. Historians still argue whether this resistance was conscious rebellion or simply habit. But it's telling that so many of these thinkers framed sleep as an act of personal will. The Church said, rise early, sleep early, confess your dreams if they were sinful. The philosophers replied, no thanks, I'll sleep when reason permits. And it wasn't just about timing, it was about the spiritual dimension. The Church taught that dreams could be divine or demonic. Sleep was a vulnerable time when your soul might stray. Waking with a disturbing vision? That needed prayer. Enlightenment thinkers, on the other hand, began to treat dreams as psychology, still mysterious, but more internal than infernal. You hear the distant sound of a shutter closing. Somewhere, a priest has just extinguished his candle. But around the corner, another window glows. Someone is still awake, likely writing a late-night letter denouncing dogma in elegant cursive. Some philosophers mock nighttime rituals, like saying prayers before bed or crossing oneself. Others, interestingly, kept those habits out of superstition or nostalgia. Rousseau, despite his complicated beliefs, sometimes described his soul's peace, after reciting old Catholic prayers, mumbled perhaps like a lullaby. Not devotion exactly, but memory. And here's a surprising twist. Despite their skepticism, many Enlightenment figures still feared nighttime punishment. Sudden death and sleep, fire, divine wrath, even ghosts. Voltaire made fun of such fears during the day, but in his more private writings, he confessed occasional unease when the wind howled outside and shadows shifted on the walls. You pass a lamppost now, still burning, one of the few oil lamps lit past midnight. They were expensive to maintain, but in areas where salons flourished, they lingered longer. The city tolerated light where wealth and intellect lived. In poorer quarters, darkness returned quickly, nudging residents toward bed, or toward trouble. Which brings you to curfews. During times of unrest, Paris imposed strict curfews, especially for unauthorized gatherings. Philosophical discussions weren't technically illegal, unless they included criticism of the monarchy, the clergy, or taxes. So yes, they were usually illegal. This made salons feel subversive. Every late night became an act of soft rebellion. One French philosopher, long since forgotten by textbooks, once wrote, "To sleep by church law is to dream someone else's dream." He meant it as an insult. But tonight you find it oddly poetic. You move now into a smaller side room, a servant's quarters perhaps. Here, sleep came differently. Faster. Harder. There were no letters to write, no sermons to critique. Just exhaustion. Church bells signaled not morality, but the end of a 14-hour day. If you rose before the priests, it was to clean their shoes. The philosophers knew this. They wrote about it. Some felt guilty. Some didn't. But all of them, whether noble or radical, lived within a system where sleep was still shaped by ancient rules, monastic rhythms, ecclesiastical timekeeping, spiritual dread. And while they tried to reason themselves out of it, the bells kept ringing. You hear one now. A soft, mournful toll in the distance. It's morning. And the paradox lingers. Enlightenment thinkers claim to be free. But even their sleep was scheduled, watched, judged, shaped, by institutions they thought they'd outgrown. You step back into the street, the bells fading behind you. Maybe tonight they'll dream without them. You leave behind the solemn echoes of church bells and find yourself in a very different corner of the Enlightenment night, this one louder, riskier, and reeking of spilt wine. Gone are the quiet salons and disciplined bedtimes. Tonight you're caught in the middle of something rowdier. Because while many philosophers wrote as if reason ruled all, some lived like chaos was the better argument. Welcome to the world of midnight duels and drunken debates. It's past 1 a.m., and you're standing outside a fashionable townhouse where voices spill into the street like a broken bottle. The door swings open. A man stumbles out, someone who quoted Plato half an hour ago, and is now loudly threatening to duel someone over a disagreement about the moral implications of asparagus. You're not sure how it got to this point. No one is. Inside, the scene is carnage by Enlightenment standards. Books tossed aside, powdered wigs slightly askew, someone weeping softly over a spilled carafe of Burgundy. The atmosphere has shifted from intellectual charm to wine-fueled ego combustion. You sidle into a room where two men are shouting about Rousseau's stance on property. One of them waves a butter knife for emphasis. You hope it's just for emphasis. Someone in the corner is quoting Cicero with increasing volume and decreasing accuracy. And in the midst of it all sits a woman calmly peeling an orange, completely unbothered. This, too, was part of the philosophical life. Sleep wasn't always lost to reflection or writing. It was often sacrificed to heated arguments, fueled by alcohol and pride. Even the most disciplined thinkers sometimes found themselves entangled in long, unproductive, gloriously dramatic nights of disagreement. Historians still argue whether these nocturnal clashes were spontaneous or performative. Some believe Enlightenment thinkers wanted their personal lives to reflect their ideas, that every night could become a battlefield for truth. Others think they just liked the sound of their own voices, especially after 3 glasses of fortified wine. Voltaire once barely avoided a duel after accusing a nobleman of ignorance during dinner. He escaped by fleeing to England. Diderot, though less combative, was known to raise his voice during heated discussions, often about art, and always just as the host was trying to go to bed. And duels? Oh yes. They happened. Not every night, not always to the death, but more often than you'd think. Honor was serious business. So was humiliation. A slight remark at 11 p.m. could become a dawn appointment involving swords, spectators, and some very poor decision-making. You lean against a wall, watching as 2 men are dragged apart by a mutual friend in a powdered wig yelling, "You'll both be exiled for this idiocy, and I'm not writing letters to the Crown again." One of them adjusts his cravat and announces, "We were merely clarifying Locke's stance on education." No one believes him. Least of all his bleeding knuckle. Quirky fact, many philosophers, especially those connected to court life, had what amounted to dual insurance. Letters pre-written in case they died. Some even had substitute arguers, friends ready to defend their ideas and their honor in a pinch. Enlightenment philosophy came with a backup plan. You slip into the back room now. It's quieter. A man slumps on a divan, one arm dangling, mouth open, snoring softly. The debate continues without him. His dream probably still contains fragments of the argument. "The general will is not a tyranny," he mumbles into the upholstery. You look down and notice a wine ring staining the edge of a treatise. There it is, the collision point between intellect and indulgence. Enlightenment thinkers weren't saints. They were human, brilliant, impulsive, and often very, very tired. Not all these gatherings were chaotic. Some remained civil all night, even as eyes drooped and words slurred. But in moments like these, you see the other side of sleeplessness. Not scholarly or spiritual, but wild. Raw. Sleep was postponed not by philosophy, but by fire. And it left a mark. Many letters from these thinkers hint at regret the morning after. Apologies for shouting. For stomping. For proposing a duel using soup spoons. Enlightenment was about improving mankind. But after midnight, mankind wasn't always interested in improvement. You step back outside. The street is quiet again. Somewhere, someone is still pacing, thinking about whether he should have said volition instead of intention. Someone else is throwing up behind a carriage. And in a small upstairs room, 2 exhausted thinkers lie side by side, one staring at the ceiling, the other asleep at last. The debate is over. For now. The city exhales. Not peacefully, but earnestly. Even here, in the margins of philosophy, you find the same truth. that brilliance often comes wrapped in disorder. That the mind, especially one addicted to truth, does not obey the clock. That sleep, when it finally comes, arrives not as a gentle visitor, but as a necessary rescue. And as you turn to leave, a half-drunken voice from a window above slurs. "Tell Diderot he was wrong," you whisper. "Aren't we all?" You step away from the fading drama of late-night debates, your ears still ringing faintly with unfinished arguments. But as you walk now, you enter a quieter part of Paris, the kind philosophers rarely wrote about but often wandered through when sleep refused to arrive, the lonely, moonlit halls of their own thoughts. This is where they faced a different kind of restlessness. One that wasn't born of wine or wit, but of sadness. You're now in the soft shadows of medicine, melancholy, and moonlight. The room you enter is sparse. A single candle burns low, barely illuminating a writing desk and an unmade bed. On the desk sits a small wooden box lined with velvet, its contents glittering faintly, vials, powders, dried herbs. And beside it, the unmistakable glint of a scalpel. No, not for surgery. Not tonight. But for leeches. Welcome to Enlightenment-era sleep medicine. This philosopher, let's call him the patient, doesn't stir when you enter. He's seated in a chair, slumped slightly to one side, a blanket around his shoulders. His eyes are open, but unfocused. You can feel the weight in the room, not intellectual weight, but emotional. Heavy, human melancholy, as if the air itself refuses to move. By the 1700s, philosophers had a curious relationship with health. Many distrusted physicians, yet were fascinated by illness. Especially mental illness. Melancholia, as they called it, was common among the educated. It was described as a fog of sadness, anxiety, sleeplessness, and dread. A philosopher's companion, it seemed. And sleep? Often the first casualty. The remedies were ambitious. Bloodletting to balance the humors. Mercury pills to purge. Corruptions. Hot wine with nutmeg, cold baths at midnight, or, perhaps worst of all, long letters of advice from equally tired friends. Historians still argue whether Enlightenment melancholy was a cultural condition, a medical misunderstanding, or just the inevitable side effect of overthinking everything. Either way, it often showed up just after sundown and refused to leave before dawn. You walk to the desk and peer into the box. One vial contains laudanum, an opium-based tincture used to ease pain and lull the mind. Another holds powdered valerian root. There's also a worn prayer card tucked beneath the lid, suggesting that even reason has its breaking point. Quirky fact: some philosophers kept leeches not just for bloodletting, but because they believed it calmed the nervous system. Place one behind the ear, wait 20 minutes, then try to sleep. If nothing else, it was distracting. The man in the chair shifts slightly. His mouth moves, but the words are faint. He's repeating a line, possibly from Pascal, or maybe just a fragment of a dream. He clutches a folded scrap of paper to his chest. You gently pry it open. It's a note, written in his own hand. "I have all the words, and none of the peace." That's the heart of it. The melancholy didn't come from failure. It came from excess. Too many ideas. Too much pressure. Too few tools to make it all go quiet. For thinkers of this age, knowledge was both salvation and torment. They craved understanding, but feared what it would cost them. You take a seat nearby and watch the candle flicker. Outside, the moonlight slices across rooftops like soft silver ribbons. Everything looks calm, but inside, the storm rages on. In moments like this, philosophers often wrote their most intimate reflections. Rousseau confessed to long nights filled with dread. Montesquieu described his soul as restless beyond cure. Diderot, in one letter, wrote that his thoughts grew teeth at night. "They bite the insides of my head." And yet they endured. They developed strange rituals. One man slept with an open book on his chest to weigh down the thoughts. Another played a flute for 20 minutes before bed. Still another, less creatively, just drank until he fell over. You glance at the shelf. There's a journal tucked between volumes of Descartes and Horace. You pull it out and read. The moonlight makes promises. The morning forgets them. Melancholy didn't just affect their sleep, it shaped their work. You can see it in their treatises, in their metaphors, in their obsession with meaning. They weren't just writing to educate the world. They were trying to rescue themselves from their own sleeplessness. And here's something beautiful. Even in their despair, they documented everything. They turned pain into prose, confusion into clarity, at least for others. Their insomnia became your philosophy textbook. Their night terrors your lecture notes. The candle sputters now. The man in the chair finally rises, slowly. He walks to the bed, stares at it as if it's a dare, then finally lies down. No prayers. No final thoughts. Just silence. You dim the flame and leave him there, wrapped in a blanket, beneath a window streaked with moonlight. Outside, the city still sleeps. Pearly. Quietly. You look up and wonder, how many of those shining windows hide men like him, wide-eyed, brilliant, afraid of their own minds? And how many of them, right now, are whispering to the dark, "Let me rest, not from the world, but from myself." You drift once more, deeper now into the spaces where silence is no longer peaceful, it's heavy. You're not in a chamber or a salon tonight. You're in the darkened guts of the Enlightenment's least flattering reality, the smells and sounds of sleep. You might expect this part to be poetic, wistful. But let's not lie to ourselves. You open a door, and the first thing that hits you is the air. Thick. Stale. A cocktail of candle wax, body odor, old wool, chamber pot fumes, and something you can only describe as philosophical despair. Because here's the thing, no matter how elegant the arguments, how revolutionary the essays, Enlightenment philosophers still lived in a world without deodorant, plumbing, or privacy. And when it came to sleep, that meant enduring an orchestra of discomfort every single night. Let's start with the chamber pot. Yes, it's here, under the bed, half covered by a decorative cloth that does absolutely nothing. The Enlightenment bedroom, like most pre-modern interiors, didn't have attached bathrooms. So if nature called at 2 a.m., you fumbled in the dark, tried not to trip over your own dignity, and prayed your candle wouldn't blow out mid-squat. You moved toward the bed, careful not to bump into the washstand, just a small bowl of cloudy water and a stiff towel. Hygiene was attempted, not guaranteed. A philosopher might wipe his face before bed, maybe change into a slightly less scratchy shirt. But real clean was rare. Which means real sleep, the deep kind, was even rarer. You sit on the edge of the mattress. It's straw-filled and lets out a small crunch. That's normal. Less normal are the smells rising from it, musty, earthy, perhaps even a trace of mildew. Mattresses were rarely washed. They were aired out in summer and flipped when someone remembered. You begin to understand why many philosophers preferred to pass out in chairs. And then, there's the soundscape. Snoring, of course. Loud, unapologetic snoring from the next room, or the same bed, depending on your social class. Most thinkers didn't live alone. They had wives, lovers, servants, siblings, students, or all of the above. Shared space meant shared sleep, or shared sleeplessness. One account from a houseguest visiting an Enlightenment writer described trying to sleep beside a man who quoted Aristotle in his dreams and flailed like a drowning man. Another journal entry from a Paris boarding house noted, "I learned 6 languages and 6 new ways to grind teeth in the dark." Historians still argue whether these crowded conditions influenced Enlightenment thought. Did living in such tight, unfiltered proximity make philosophers more tolerant? More irritable? Maybe both. Maybe that's why they wrote so much. You'd write too if the only way to escape your roommate's 2 a.m. monologue about Rousseau was to hide behind a quill. You lean back. There's something else, mice. Yes, actual mice. Scurrying behind the paneling. They were a feature, not a bug, of city life. Philosopher or not, you shared your home with creatures that had no respect for candle hours. Some thinkers wrote about them. Voltaire called them the midnight skeptics. You're pretty sure he was only half joking. Quirky fact: it wasn't uncommon for people to sleep with pets in their beds, not for love, but for warmth. Tiny dogs, even cats, served as foot warmers. Of course, they also barked at shadows and coughed up hairballs into your only pair of clean socks. Philosophical comfort, indeed. Let's not forget the outside noise. Paris, even before the Industrial Revolution, was a city that never quite shut up. Hooves echoed down cobblestone alleys. Vendors sang at dawn. Street fights broke out over nothing. Some philosophers tried to block it out with pillows. Others cursed it in multiple languages. A few simply leaned into the chaos, convinced that true sleep was impossible without ambient strife. There's a letter from Diderot that mentions a lullaby of rats, hooves, and idiocy. He claimed it calmed him. Somehow. You close your eyes now and try to imagine falling asleep here. The sheets are itchy. The air is stale. Somewhere nearby, someone is wheezing. You hear a creak, floorboard or philosophical breakthrough? Hard to say. The walls are thin. A sneeze upstairs. A cough down below. A sigh beside you. And yet, they slept. Not always well. Not always long. But they did it. Somehow, in this mess of odor and noise, of straw and smoke, they found moments, fleeting, fragile moments, where the mind let go. It's humbling. Because for all our modern comforts, foam pillows, blackout curtains, white noise machines, we still lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, chased by thoughts. They did too. Only their ceilings cracked. Their beds wheezed. And their dreams smelled faintly of candle soot and mold. Still they dreamed. Still they thought. Still, they woke up and tried again. You pulled a blanket over your nose, not for warmth, but protection. You settle into the sounds, the scrape of quill on paper next door, the wind rattling a shutter, a distant cat serenading the moon. You're still not entirely sure how anyone slept in 18th century France. But somehow they did. You open your eyes, not because you're rested, but because the city's light is creeping in again. The shutters are cracked. The candle has died. You've made it through the long Enlightenment night, and you're about to witness its final act. Not the flicker of reason or a whispered argument about Rousseau. This time, it's the silence that comes after it all. Tonight you've arrived at the long nap, death, decay, and legacy. The philosopher whose room you enter now is quiet in a way that no snore or creaking bed frame could ever imitate. His hands are folded across his chest, not out of decorum, but because someone placed them there. He is gone, truly asleep now, the kind of sleep that lasts longer than any theory, any argument, any lover's sigh in the candlelight. You approach slowly. The bed is grand, more so than you expected. The curtains are drawn back, the sheets smoothed. He looks peaceful. But don't be fooled. This stillness was earned, paid for in years of tension, insomnia, writing, and revolt. In the 18th century, the deaths of philosophers were public affairs. Some tried to stage it. Voltaire, for example, had a famously dramatic exit. After years of skirmishes with the church, he returned to Paris and died surrounded by fans and foes alike. Some claimed he recanted. Others swore he smirked in defiance. Historians still argue whether he died a believer, a cynic, or just tired. Then there was Diderot, dead at his writing desk. No fanfare. No curtain call. Just silence and a final unfinished thought. And Rousseau? Exiled, embraced, exiled again, eventually laid to rest in a setting far too elegant for a man who preferred tree roots and rough blankets. His legacy would be dissected just as his sleep had been, misunderstood, idolized, misquoted, turned into curriculum. You look at the philosopher in the bed again. His face is pale, his mouth slightly open. Around him, the room remains untouched. A pen lies dry beside a closed notebook. The fire has long gone out. A servant, perhaps the last one left, quietly adjusts the corner of the blanket, as if tucking in the future. Philosophers often wrote about death as the great sleep. Epicurus said we shouldn't fear it because we won't feel it. Pascal feared it immensely. Rousseau romanticized it. Voltaire laughed at it, nervously. But in practice, death was rarely poetic. It was messy, painful, often smelly. Remember that these were people who lived without antibiotics, without anesthesia, without privacy. Final illnesses dragged on for weeks. Delirium was common. The sleep they longed for came only after tremendous noise and discomfort. And yet, they left behind everything. The sleepless nights, the pages inked at 3 a.m., the arguments shouted across candlelit rooms, all of it outlived them. They couldn't rest while they were alive. But they made sure their ideas would never sleep. Quirky fact: some philosophers left behind instructions for how they wanted to die and be remembered. Montesquieu wanted a quiet burial. Voltaire wanted to be buried standing up. He wasn't. One thinker requested his body be dissected and studied as a final contribution to reason. The Church, unsurprisingly, vetoed that idea. Their beds, those creaky sanctuaries of intermittent sleep, sometimes became shrines. Visitors would later come to see where a certain philosopher slept forever, as if the site itself held residual genius. Candles were lit. Letters were left. Tour guides whispered about final words that may or may not have ever been spoken. You walk over to the window and pull it open. The early air rushes in, cool, sharp, indifferent. The street is beginning to stir. Life continues. But behind you, the philosopher doesn't. And that's the strange beauty of it. He's at peace now. No more letters to write. No more duels to duck. No more manuscripts ruined by snoring roommates or spilled ink. Just rest. True rest. Sleep, the thing he mocked, dissected, postponed for decades, finally came for him. And he didn't fight. He just let go. You glance at his desk one last time. A small piece of paper lies there, almost unnoticed. A note. 4 words. I am finally quiet. You fold it gently. Step out into the hallway. And as you walk away from the room, you realize something. 4 men who spent their lives refusing to rest. They sure left us a lot to think about. Word count, 1093. Wind down, 300 words. And now, as the city fades behind you and the candlelight gives way to darkness, you feel yourself softening into sleep too. The philosophers are quiet now. Their papers are stacked. Their pens are still. The tension of ideas, the echo of endless questions, begins to fade, one breath at a time. Outside, the wind moves slowly through alleyways. Not rushing. Just passing by. A dog sleeps by a tavern door. A shutter claps once, then settles. The arguments, the insomnia, the worry, they are distant now, like dreams dissolving in morning light. You imagine Rousseau beneath a tree, finally warm. Voltaire in a chair, head nodding just before the candle goes out. Diderot asleep without apology, without edits. All of them, resting. And you, too, are allowed to rest. There's nothing left to solve tonight. No debate to win. No legacy to defend. Just breath. And softness. And silence. The blanket gathers around your shoulders. The fan hums softly in the background. The air settles. Even your thoughts, so used to circling, seem willing to drift. You've followed their stories. You've laughed at their quirks. You've seen their struggles. And now you let it go. Let the last candle gutter out. Let the last page stay unturned. Let the sleep that eluded even the greatest minds finally find you. You're safe here. You're still. And somewhere between memory and moonlight. You fall. You sleep. You dream.